Emma's fingers trembled as she reached toward the photograph, but stopped just short of the glass. Her father's eyes sparkled with the same mischievous glint she remembered from bedtime stories, when he'd lean close and whisper tales of Norse gods and forgotten magic. But those eyes belonged to a memory now, not this impossible image mounted between a rusted Viking axe and a shield bearing wolves. "You recognize him." Astrid's voice carried the weight of winter storms, yet somehow warmed the air around them. She moved with fluid grace, her red braids catching firelight from a hearth that crackled despite no visible chimney. "Magnus spoke of you often, little raven." "My daddy's name was Michael." Emma's voice came out smaller than she intended. "And you're not real. Vikings are dead. They've been dead for a really long time." Astrid knelt beside her, close enough that Emma could see intricate silver threads woven through her woolen dress, close enough to catch the scent of pine forests and sea salt that seemed to cling to her skin. Death is not always the ending your people believe it to be. Sometimes it is merely a crossing. The hall around them defied explanation. Wooden beams stretched overhead, carved with intertwining serpents and ravens that seemed to shift in the flickering light. Tapestries depicted great ships cutting through stormy seas, while weapons and artifacts lined the walls in careful arrangement. Yet beneath the ancient atmosphere, Emma's sharp eyes caught impossible details. Electric warmth without visible wiring, light that seemed to emanate from the wood itself. "How do you know about Daddy?" Emma whispered, her gaze returning to the photograph. In it, her father stood beside Astrid in what looked like this very hall, both of them laughing at some shared joke. His clothes were modern, the blue sweater she remembered him wearing that last Christmas. But everything else felt timeless, eternal. Astrid's weathered hand gestured toward the image. "He came to me as you have, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. The blood of the old ways runs strong in your family line, child. Your father understood this, even when the rational world sought to bury such truths beneath facts and formulas." Outside, Emma could hear the distant sounds of the excavation, her mother's voice directing the graduate students, the scrape of brushes against stone, the excited chatter of discovery. That world felt increasingly distant, as if she'd wandered not just away from the dig site, but away from everything familiar. "Mama says Daddy drowned in the fjord during his research trip." Emma's words came out flat, practiced from 2 years of explaining to classmates and concerned adults. "She says he was studying ancient trade routes and the ice gave way under him. She says lots of things about accepting reality and moving forward. Your mother sees only what can be measured and catalogued." Astrid rose, moving to a wooden chest carved with runic symbols. "She is a brilliant woman, but brilliance can sometimes blind us to deeper mysteries. Tell me, child, in your heart, did it ever feel like goodbye? That last time you saw him?" Emma's breath caught. She remembered that morning with crystalline clarity, her father's unusually long hug, the way he'd looked at her as if memorizing her face, his promise to bring her back something special from Norway. It hadn't felt like goodbye, it had felt like a secret. "He said he had to check on something important," Emma admitted. "Something about family history and promises that needed keeping." Astrid opened the chest, revealing objects that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Ancient coins, carved bone artifacts, and there, Emma gasped, her father's research journal, the one that had supposedly been lost with him in the icy waters. "Some promises transcend the boundaries of single lifetimes," Astrid said, lifting the journal with reverent care. "Your father understood this better than most. He carried the memories of his bloodline, like others carry photographs in their wallets." Emma's hands shook as she accepted the familiar leather-bound book. Her father's handwriting covered the pages, notes about archaeological sites, sketches of runic symbols, but also entries that made no sense. References to maintaining the connection, Astrid's warnings, and most disturbing of all, detailed descriptions of this hall, written weeks before his death. "This is impossible," Emma breathed. But even as she said it, something deep inside her recognized the truth thrumming through these pages. Her father's neat handwriting grew more urgent toward the final entries, filled with references to ancient agreements and the price of keeping old pathways open. Astrid's expression grew grave. Your father was the bridge between worlds, child. When he crossed over, that bridge began to weaken. The connection your bloodline has maintained for generations grows thin. What connection? Emma clutched the journal to her chest, feeling her father's presence in every worn page. The bond between the realm of the living and the eternal halls where heroes feast. Astrid's eyes held depths like winter fjords. Without it, both worlds will fade into shadow, the ordinary world. Emma jolted awake to the harsh buzz of her alarm, the journal clutched against her chest like a shield. For a disorienting moment, she expected to see carved wooden beams overhead, to smell pine forests and ancient smoke. Instead, fluorescent lights hummed above the cramped hotel room, casting everything in sterile white. Her mother's laptop glowed on the small desk, displaying spreadsheets of artifact catalogs and dig schedules. Emma? You're up early. Dr. Sarah Larsen emerged from the bathroom, already dressed in her practical excavation clothes, thermal layers, waterproof boots, her auburn hair pulled back in the no-nonsense bun that had become her trademark since becoming a widow. Did you sleep all right? You were talking in your sleep again. Emma quickly shoved the journal under her pillow, heart hammering. In the harsh morning light, holding her father's supposedly lost research felt like grasping smoke. Had she dreamed the entire encounter? The photograph, Astrid's impossible haul, the weight of ancient secrets, it all seemed too vivid for a dream, yet too impossible for reality. Just nightmares about the dig site, Emma mumbled, which wasn't entirely untrue. She swung her legs over the side of the narrow bed, her sock feet finding the cold hotel carpet. Do I have to come with you today? Sarah's expression softened with familiar guilt. Emma, we've talked about this. I can't leave you alone in a foreign country, and Mrs. Hansen is busy with her own children. Just bring your books. You can set up in the trailer again. It has good heating. Emma nodded, though the thought of returning to that place where impossible things lived just beyond the excavation barriers made her stomach twist. She pulled on her layers mechanically. Thermal shirt, sweater, the puffy winter coat that made her look like a small Arctic explorer. In the bathroom mirror, her reflection looked pale and uncertain. Dark circles under eyes that held too many questions for someone who wouldn't turn 9 until spring. The breakfast room buzzed with the familiar morning energy of her mother's team. Graduate students hunched over steaming coffee cups, discussing ground-penetrating radar results and ceramic fragment classifications. Dr. Peterson, the expedition's Norse culture specialist, gestured enthusiastically about burial practices while buttering his toast. These people lived in a world of measurable facts, carbon dating, and peer-reviewed theories. Emma picked at her breakfast, watching her mother coordinate the day's activities with the efficiency that had made her one of the youngest department heads at the University of Minnesota. Sarah Larsen had built her career on precision, on coaxing secrets from ancient civilizations through careful methodology and rational analysis. She had no patience for ghost stories or children's fantasies about mystical Viking women. The chamber we uncovered yesterday is remarkable, Sarah was telling the team, her voice carrying the excitement that always colored discussions of significant finds. The preservation is unprecedented. We're looking at potentially the most intact Viking burial site discovered in this region. Emma's fork clattered against her plate. The burial site, where Astrid claimed to be guardian, where her father's photograph hung on impossible walls. Emma? Her mother's concerned voice drew the attention of the entire table. Are you feeling sick? Just tired, Emma managed, though exhaustion felt like the wrong word for the bone-deep confusion that had settled into her chest. She missed her father with an ache that time had dulled but never erased, missed the bedtime stories about brave heroes and magical realms, missed feeling like someone understood the part of her that preferred books to people and ancient myths to playground games. The team's conversation drifted back to technical discussions about soil samples and artifact preservation protocols. Emma retreated into herself, a skill she'd perfected over the past 2 years. At home in Minneapolis, she could disappear into the school library during recess, lose herself in stories about ordinary children discovering extraordinary worlds. Here, Surrounded by adults whose passion for the past felt academic rather than personal, she felt more isolated than ever. Her mother had tried to frame this trip as an adventure, quality time together in the land of Emma's beloved Norse myths. But Sarah saw only professional opportunity where Emma had once imagined magic. The fjords were geological formations, not pathways to Asgard. The ancient sites were valuable research opportunities, not doorways to wonder. As the team prepared to depart for the dig site, Emma's fingers found her father's journal through her coat pocket. Its leather binding felt warm against her palm, more real than the hotel's artificial heat. Whether dream or vision, or something else entirely, Astrid's words echoed through her thoughts. The connection your bloodline has maintained for generations grows thin. Emma didn't fully understand what that meant, but she recognized the feeling behind it. Something precious was slipping away, had been slipping away since her father's death. Her mother's rational world offered safety and stability, but it left no room for the magic that had once made Emma feel connected to something larger than herself. The bus ride to the excavation site stretched ahead, carrying her back toward questions that threatened everything she thought she knew about reality, family, and the thin places where impossible things might still exist. The bus lurched over another frozen rut, and Emma pressed her face to the frost-etched window as the excavation site came into view. Her breath fogged the glass as she watched the familiar cluster of white research tents and equipment trailers scattered across the snow-covered landscape like a small Arctic village. But today, something was different. Where yesterday there had been a modest rectangular excavation, now a much larger area lay exposed to the winter sky. The graduate students clustered around the expanded dig site, their excited voices carrying across the crisp air even through the bus windows. Emma's stomach tightened as she recognized the location, exactly where she remembered finding the entrance to Astrid's hall. "My God," her mother breathed from the seat ahead, pressing her own face to the window. They found something significant. Dr. Peterson was already on his feet before the bus stopped, gathering his equipment with barely contained enthusiasm. The overnight crew said they hit something around midnight, stonework, possibly a secondary chamber. Emma's fingers closed around the journal in her pocket as the team poured off the bus into the biting morning air. The leather binding felt almost warm, as if responding to their proximity to the dig site. She followed reluctantly, her boots crunching through snow that seemed deeper here, more pristine, as though the very ground held older secrets. "Dr. Larsen!" One of the graduate students jogged toward them, his face flushed with excitement and cold. "You need to see this. The ground-penetrating radar is showing structures that don't match any known Viking construction patterns." Sarah's professional composure couldn't quite hide her excitement as she strode toward the excavation. Emma trailed behind, each step feeling heavier than the last. The exposed earth revealed carefully fitted stones arranged in patterns that seemed to shift and flow like frozen water. Ancient timber beams emerged from the soil with a preservation that defied explanation. The wood looked as though it had been cut yesterday rather than buried for centuries. "The carbon dating equipment is giving us impossible readings," another team member called out, frustration evident in his voice. "The samples are testing as both ancient and contemporary. It has to be equipment malfunction." Emma edged closer to the excavation's boundary, her heart hammering against her ribs. There, partially uncovered, lay a doorway carved from stone and timber that she recognized with bone-deep certainty, the same doorway she had stepped through to find Astrid's hall. "Emma, stay back from the edge," her mother called absently, too absorbed in examining runic carvings to notice her daughter's pale face. These stones could be unstable. But Emma couldn't move away. As she stared into the partially excavated entrance, she caught the unmistakable scent of pine forests and wood smoke drifting up from the depths. The graduate students seemed oblivious to it, focused on their instruments and documentation, but to Emma, it was as clear as her mother's voice. "The really strange thing," Dr. Peterson was saying, crouched beside an exposed timber beam, "is that some of these artifacts appear to be arranged deliberately, as if someone has been maintaining them." "Don't be ridiculous," Sarah replied. But Emma caught the uncertainty in her mother's voice. "We're looking at natural preservation due to specific soil conditions and climate factors." A shadow fell across the excavation site, and Emma looked up to see clouds gathering with unnatural speed. The wind picked up, carrying with it something that made several of the graduate students look around nervously, as though they'd heard their names called from a great distance. "Mama?" Emma said quietly, but her voice was lost in the sudden bustle as the team hurried to cover sensitive equipment against the approaching weather. That's when Emma saw her. Just for a moment, standing at the far edge of the excavation site where the snow-covered ground met the tree line. Astrid, her red braids whipping in the wind, her ancient clothing somehow more vivid and real than the modern expedition surrounding Emma. Their eyes met across the distance, and Astrid raised one weathered hand, not in greeting, but in unmistakable urgency. The wind intensified, and several loose papers whirled away from the documentation tables. In the chaos of securing equipment, no one noticed Emma take a step closer to the excavation's edge, then another. The scent of wood smoke grew stronger, and she could swear she heard the distant crackle of a hearth fire echoing up from the exposed stones. "Emma?" Her mother's sharp voice cut through the wind. "Get to the trailer now. This weather is moving in faster than predicted." Emma hesitated, torn between obedience and the pull she felt toward the uncovered entrance. Astrid still stood at the tree line, and even from this distance, Emma could see the ancient woman's lips moving, though her words were lost in the wind. The journal in Emma's pocket grew almost hot against her fingers, and she suddenly understood that this moment, this choice between the safety of the heated trailer and the impossible doorway half buried in ancient earth, would change everything. The expedition team scattered toward shelter, but Emma remained frozen at the edge of discovery, caught between worlds. The wind whipped around Emma like invisible hands trying to pull her in different directions. Her mother's team rushed past her toward the trailers, their urgent voices growing distant as equipment rattled and tarps snapped in the sudden gale. But Emma couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from Astrid's figure at the tree line. What if it's all in my head? The thought struck her with paralyzing force. What if the journal in her pocket was just her imagination, conjured by a grieving child's desperate need to feel close to her father? What if Astrid was nothing more than a stress-induced hallucination, born from too many sleepless nights and too many unanswered questions about her father's death? Emma's rational mind, the part that sounded increasingly like her mother, catalogued all the impossibilities. People didn't live for 1,000 years. Ancient halls couldn't exist beneath modern excavation sites. The dead didn't leave behind photographs in mystical realms. Yet her fingers traced the journal's leather binding through her coat, feeling its undeniable weight and warmth. The scent of wood smoke grew stronger despite the Arctic wind, and she could hear something beneath the chaos of the storm. Music, perhaps, or voices raised in harmony from some impossible depth. "Emma Larsen, get to shelter now." Her mother's voice carried a sharp edge of fear that Emma had only heard once before, the night they'd received the phone call about her father's accident. The memory hit her like a physical blow. She remembered her mother's face crumpling as she hung up the phone, remembered the awful silence that followed, remembered how Sarah had immediately begun speaking in careful, measured tones about accidents and recovery efforts and the importance of staying strong. Even in her grief, her mother had retreated into facts and procedures, building walls of rationality against the inexplicable loss. What would happen if Emma walked away now, if she followed her mother to the safety of heated trailers and logical explanations? The journal would disappear, she was certain of it, taking with it the last tangible connection to her father's secrets. Astrid would fade back into the tree line, and Emma would spend the rest of her life wondering if she'd been brave enough to discover the truth. But what if following Astrid meant losing her mother forever? What if stepping through that impossible doorway trapped her in some realm where 8-year-old girls couldn't return? Emma's chest tightened with the familiar panic that struck whenever she thought about being completely alone. Her father was already gone. If something happened to her, if she vanished into ancient mysteries the way he had into the fjord's icy waters, Sarah would be left with nothing. "Some connections are too powerful for even time to sever," Astrid had said. But what about the connections that bound Emma to the living world? What about her responsibility to her grieving mother, who had already lost too much? The wind died suddenly, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the distant slam of trailer doors. Emma realized with growing dread that the expedition team had all reached safety, all except her. She stood alone at the excavation's edge, caught between Astrid's urgent beckoning and the warm glow of trailer windows where her mother was probably just now realizing her daughter wasn't among the group. Astrid stepped closer, no longer at the tree line, but at the very edge of the dig site. Up close, her ancient eyes held depths that seemed to contain centuries of accumulated wisdom and sorrow. When she spoke, her voice somehow carried clearly, despite the impossible distance between them. The choice is yours, young one, but know that some doors, once closed, do not open again in the same lifetime. Emma's breath came in sharp puffs as panic clawed at her chest. She was 8 years old. She liked books and quiet corners and the safety of predictable routines. She wasn't meant for impossible choices between worlds, wasn't equipped to carry the weight of ancient bloodlines and mystical connections. What would Daddy want me to do? But that question brought no comfort, because she was beginning to suspect that her father had faced this same terrible choice, and his decision had led him away from her forever. Had he chosen Astrid's realm over his family? Had he walked willingly into that fjord, knowing it would take him somewhere his wife and daughter couldn't follow? The trailer door burst open, spilling yellow light across the snow. "Emma!" Sarah's voice cracked with terror as she spotted her daughter still standing by the excavation. "What are you doing? Get away from there!" Emma turned toward her mother's voice, seeing Sarah stumble through the deep snow with desperate urgency. In that moment, her mother looked young and frightened, not like the composed professor who had answers for everything, but like someone who had already lost too much and couldn't bear to lose more. When Emma looked back toward the excavation, Astrid was gone. Only the exposed stones remained, silent and ordinary beneath the cloudy sky. The journal in her pocket had gone cold. "I'm fine, Mama," Emma called out, but her voice sounded thin and uncertain even to herself. She took a step back from the excavation's edge as Sarah reached her, breathing hard from her desperate sprint through the deep snow. "What were you doing?" Sarah's hands found Emma's shoulders, gripping almost too tightly. "The weather turned so quickly, and when I realized you weren't with us..." Her voice broke, and Emma saw tears freezing at the corners of her mother's eyes. "I was just looking," Emma said, which was true enough. She had been looking, at doorways that shouldn't exist, at ancient women who claimed to know her father's secrets, at choices that felt far too large for someone who still slept with a nightlight. Sarah pulled her close, and Emma breathed in the familiar scent of her mother's perfume mixed with the dust of ancient artifacts. For a moment, she let herself imagine staying right here in the safety of her mother's arms, returning to their hotel room, flying back to Minneapolis where impossible things didn't intrude on ordinary days. But the journal in her pocket remained warm despite Astrid's disappearance, a constant reminder that some mysteries wouldn't simply vanish because she chose to ignore them. As they walked toward the trailer together, Emma's fingers traced its leather binding through her coat. The warmth pulsed like a heartbeat, urgent and alive. "The storm's getting worse," Sarah murmured, guiding Emma up the trailer steps. "We'll wait it out here, then head back to the hotel early today." Inside the heated trailer, the expedition team clustered around laptops and equipment monitors, their earlier excitement dampened by the sudden weather change. Dr. Peterson looked up as they entered, his weathered face creased with concern. "Everything secure out there?" he asked. "For now," Sarah replied, helping Emma out of her coat. "Though I've never seen weather move in that fast. The barometric readings must have been completely off." Emma settled into a corner chair, pulling one of her books from her backpack with hands that still trembled slightly. But as she opened at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the words seemed to shift and blur on the page. Lucy Pevensy's discovery of Narnia through the wardrobe felt suddenly impossibly relevant. How many times had Emma read this passage about a girl stepping through an ordinary door into an extraordinary world? How many times had she wished for her own magical doorway? Now, faced with what might be exactly that, she felt only terror. "Emma?" Her mother's voice was gentle. "You look pale. "Are you feeling sick?" "Just cold," Emma managed, though the trailer's heating system hummed efficiently around them. She wasn't cold. She was burning up with the weight of secrets and impossible decisions. The journal's warmth had spread through her entire body, as if something ancient and powerful was awakening in her blood. Through the trailer window, she could see the excavation site. The exposed stones looked ordinary now, just archaeological remains partially covered by wind-blown snow. But Emma knew what lay beneath those stones, knew that somewhere in the depths, Astrid's hall existed with its impossible warmth and her father's photograph mounted on the wall like a shrine. The connection your bloodline has maintained for generations grows thin. The words echoed in Emma's memory as she watched her mother organize field notes with the methodical precision that had always defined Sarah's approach to the world. Her mother lived in a realm of measurable facts and documented evidence. She had built her career on the belief that the past could be understood through careful study, that mysteries could be solved through proper methodology. But what if some mysteries couldn't be solved from the outside? What if understanding required stepping through doorways that rational minds insisted couldn't exist? Emma's chest tightened as she realized the awful truth. She was going to have to choose. Not someday. Not when she was older and braver, but now. Tonight. The journal's increasing warmth told her that much. Whatever window of opportunity Astrid represented was closing, had perhaps been closing since the moment her father died 2 years ago. She could stay safe in her mother's world of heated trailers and logical explanations. She could return to Minneapolis and spend the rest of her life wondering if she'd been brave enough to discover the truth about her father's death. Or she could step through an impossible doorway into an ancient realm where time bent and the dead might not stay dead, risking everything for answers that might destroy her understanding of reality itself. The storm rattled the trailer windows, and Emma pulled her book closer to her chest. But instead of comfort, she felt only the terrible weight of choice pressing down on her 8-year-old shoulders. Some decisions, she was learning, couldn't be postponed until you felt ready to make them. Outside, snow covered the excavation site like a burial shroud, hiding secrets that called to her blood with increasing urgency. The journal pulsed against her ribs, warm and insistent as a second heart. Emma closed her eyes and knew that when darkness fell, she would have to choose between worlds. Darkness came early, swallowing the excavation site in thick shadows that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Emma lay in her narrow hotel bed, listening to her mother's steady breathing from across the room. The journal pressed against her ribs beneath her pajamas, its warmth now so intense it felt like carrying a coal from Astrid's hearth. "Choose," the ancient voice whispered in her memory, "but know that some doors, once closed, do not open again." Emma's fingers trembled as she slipped from beneath the covers. Her mother didn't stir. Sarah had been exhausted after the day's strange weather and equipment malfunctions, falling asleep over her field notes. The dig site had yielded more questions than answers, carbon dating results that made no sense, and stone arrangements that seemed to shift when no one was looking directly at them. The hotel room key card felt impossibly heavy in Emma's small hand as she crept toward the door. Each step away from her sleeping mother felt like crossing an ocean. Once she left this room, she sensed there would be no returning unchanged, if she returned at all. The lobby stood empty except for a night clerk who didn't look up from his book as Emma passed. Outside, the Norwegian winter bit through her coat with vicious teeth, but the journal's warmth spread outward from her chest, creating a circle of impossible heat around her small body. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she made her way back toward the excavation site, following a pull in her blood that grew stronger with each step. The dig site looked different in the darkness. The modern equipment, cameras, measuring tools, the generators that powered the expedition's technology, seemed diminished, almost transparent against the ancient stones. Emma approached the exposed entrance cautiously, her breath forming clouds that the journal's warmth immediately dissolved. "You came." Emma spun toward the voice, her heart hammering. Astrid emerged from the shadows between the pine trees, but she wasn't alone. 3 other figures flanked her, a tall man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, a woman whose silver hair was braided with what looked like starlight, and someone whose age and gender seemed to shift, depending on how Emma looked at them. My kinspeople, Astrid said, noticing Emma's wide-eyed stare. Guardians, as I am, we have waited long for Larsen blood to return to us. The tall man stepped forward, and Emma caught the scent of sea salt and distant storms clinging to his clothes. I am Eric Stormcaller. Your father spoke of you often, little daughter. You knew my daddy? Emma's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. No, corrected the silver-haired woman. Time moves differently in our realm. I am Ingrid Moonweaver, and your father sits at our table still, though the living world believes him drowned. Emma's chest constricted. He's alive? The shape-shifting figure spoke in a voice like wind through ancient trees. Life and death are constructs of linear time. We exist in the spaces between moments, where those bonds that transcend mortality take root. Astrid raised a weathered hand. Do not overwhelm the child with philosophy, Raven. She faces trials enough. The ancient woman's gaze fixed on Emma with devastating compassion. Yes, little one, your father lives, but not as the living world understands life. To reach him, you must first prove worthy of our realm's protection. Prove worthy how? Emma asked, though part of her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. Eric pointed toward the exposed entrance of the excavation. The passage between worlds requires more than blood. It demands courage, wisdom, and the willingness to sacrifice comfortable lies for difficult truths. You must descend alone, face what waits in the depths, and choose correctly when the moment comes. What waits in the depths? Your greatest fear, Ingrid said simply, and your greatest strength. Emma looked at the stone doorway, now emanating a soft blue light that her mother's equipment had never detected. The warmth from the journal spread through her entire body, but instead of comfort, it brought a strange clarity. She thought of her father's photograph on Astrid's wall, his expression peaceful in a way she'd never seen during his life. What if I fail? Raven's shifting form solidified slightly, revealing eyes that held starlight. Failure means remaining trapped between worlds, neither fully alive nor properly dead. It is why your father's connection to you has grown thin. He waits, but waiting requires strength, and strength fades without renewal. The choice must be freely made, Astrid added. We cannot compel you, cannot promise you will emerge unchanged. Your mother's world of facts and measurements will seem small after you've walked in the spaces between moments. But your father has waited 2 years for someone of his blood to bridge the gap between realms. Emma stared at the glowing entrance, understanding finally crystallizing like ice in her veins. This wasn't just about finding her father. It was about becoming something more than human, accepting a heritage that stretched back through generations of Larsens who had walked between worlds. The journal pulsed one final time, then went silent against her chest. Above them, the northern lights began to dance, painting the snow in colors that had no names in any living language. Emma stood transfixed by the aurora's impossible dance, feeling the weight of 4 ancient gazes upon her. The journal against her chest had gone silent, but its absence of warmth felt more ominous than its burning presence. Around her, the night air crackled with otherworldly energy that made her teeth ache and her vision blur at the edges. The passage opens now, Astrid said quietly. When the lights touch the earth, the doorway becomes stable enough for living flesh to traverse. But only for a short while. Emma watched in terrified fascination as tendrils of green and gold light descended from the sky like ethereal fingers, reaching toward the exposed stone entrance. Where they touched the ancient symbols carved into the doorframe, the rock began to pulse with that same soft blue glow, growing brighter with each passing moment. What about Mama? The question tore from Emma's throat before she could stop it. If I don't come back, she will grieve, Ingrid said with brutal honesty, as she grieves your father now. But grief transforms, child. It can become acceptance, even understanding, given time. Eric stepped closer, his sea storm scent intensifying. Your mother's bloodline is strong but purely mortal. She cannot follow where you must go. This burden falls to you alone, as it fell to your father before you. The mention of her father sent a sharp pang through Emma's chest. She thought of the countless nights she'd cried herself to sleep, clutching his old sweater and breathing in the fading scent of his cologne. She thought of her mother's careful explanations about accidents and hypothermia, the rational words that had never quite covered the jagged hole his absence left in their lives. "Tell me about the trial," Emma said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "What kind of fear am I supposed to face?" Raven's form shifted, becoming momentarily solid enough to reveal intricate tattoos that seemed to move across their skin. "The depths hold mirrors, young Larsen. They reflect not what you are, but what you most dread becoming. Your father faced his fear of inadequacy, the terror that he was not strong enough, wise enough, worthy enough to protect those he loved." "And he passed?" Emma asked. Astrid's expression grew sorrowful. "He passed, yes. But the trial changed him, as it changes all who survive it. When he returned to your world, he carried knowledge that ate at him like poison. He knew things about your bloodline, about the responsibilities that would one day fall to you, that he could not share with your mother." Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Is that why he went to the fjord? Because of what he learned?" "He went to protect you," Eric said firmly. The connection between realms was growing unstable. Forces that should remain buried were stirring. "Your father tried to seal the passage from our side to spare you this choice." "But sealing the passage required a life freely given," Ingrid added, "a blood sacrifice from one who belonged to both worlds. He hoped his death would end the Larsen legacy's obligation to serve as guardians." "He was wrong," Raven whispered. "The blood runs too deep, the connection too strong. His sacrifice only delayed the inevitable." Emma's hands clenched into fists. All this time, she'd believed her father's death was an accident, a tragic combination of icy water and bad luck. Now she learned it had been a sacrifice, an attempt to protect her from a destiny she apparently couldn't escape anyway. "So he died for nothing?" The words came out harsh, bitter with an 8-year-old's fury at the unfairness of adult choices. "Not for nothing," Astrid said gently. "His sacrifice bought you time to grow stronger, to develop the courage you'll need for what lies ahead. And his love anchored him in our realm, rather than letting him pass beyond entirely. Without that anchor, this bridge between worlds would have collapsed years ago." The aurora's lights grew brighter, their earthward tendrils now touching the stone entrance directly. The carved symbols blazed with blue fire, and Emma could feel power building in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. "Choose now," Eric urged. "The window closes with the dawn, and may not open again for another generation." Emma looked back toward the distant hotel, where her mother slept peacefully in their shared room. Sarah would wake to find only an empty bed and unanswered questions. She would call the police, organize search parties, cling to the rational hope that her daughter had simply wandered off and could be found through proper procedure. But Emma understood now that some disappearances couldn't be solved by search teams and helicopters. Some mysteries required stepping through doorways that official investigators would never even see. The journal against her chest suddenly flared to life again, burning hot as a brand. Emma gasped, pressing her hand to the spot where its warmth seared through her pajamas. "Your father calls," Astrid said simply. "He knows the time has come." Emma took a trembling step toward the blazing entrance, then another. Behind her, the 4 guardians watched in silence as she approached her destiny with small, brave steps that carried the weight of generations. The blue light reached out to welcome her home. The blue light enveloped Emma like warm honey, and the world dissolved. She found herself falling, not through air, but through layers of time itself. Fragments of memory flashed around her, Viking longships cutting through midnight waters, her great-grandmother's weathered hands teaching a young girl to read ancient runes, her father as a child standing in this very same light with tears streaming down his face. The journal against her chest burned like a star, and Emma realized it wasn't just her father's, it had belonged to Larsens stretching back centuries, each one recording their journey through this impossible passage. Then her feet touched solid stone, and the vision stopped. Emma stood in a vast cavern that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of space. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, lost in shadows that moved with their own purpose. Ancient symbols covered every surface, glowing with the same blue fire as the entrance above, but here the light felt hungry, watchful. The air tasted of copper and old bones. "Hello, little daughter." Emma spun toward the voice, her heart leaping with desperate hope. But the figure that emerged from the shadows wasn't her father. Not exactly. It wore his face, his clothes, even the small scar above his left eyebrow from when he'd fallen off his bicycle at age 7. But its eyes held depths that no mortal gaze should possess, and when it smiled, Emma glimpsed something ancient and terrible behind her father's familiar features. "You're not him," she whispered, backing against the cavern wall. "I am what he became," the thing replied, its voice a perfect mimicry of the bedtime stories and gentle scoldings Emma remembered. "I am what you will become, if you lack the strength to choose differently." More figures stepped from the shadows, her mother, but with Emma's own eyes staring from Sarah's face, cold and accusing. Her grandmother, dead since Emma was 5, pointing a skeletal finger in judgment, each face beloved, each expression twisted into something that made Emma's soul recoil in horror. "Do you see now?" the false father asked conversationally. "This is what becomes of those who walk between worlds. We lose ourselves piece by piece until only the shell remains. Your real father fights this fate even now, clinging to memories of warmth and love, while eternity slowly devours his humanity." Emma pressed herself harder against the stone wall, feeling the ancient symbols burning against her back through her pajamas. The journal's heat had become unbearable, but she couldn't bring herself to tear it away from her chest. It was the only real thing in this place of twisted reflections. "I can spare you this corruption," the creature wearing her father's face continued, stepping closer with movements that were almost right, almost human. "Accept what I offer, and you can return to your mother unchanged. I will close the passage permanently. Your bloodline's obligation will end with you, and you can live a normal, mortal life." "What's the cost?" Emma asked, though she already suspected the answer. The false father's smile grew wider, showing too many teeth. "Only your real father's soul. He will fade into nothing, and the guardian's realm will collapse, but you will be free. Isn't that what any loving parent would want for their child? Freedom from ancient burdens and impossible choices?" Emma thought of her father's photograph on Astrid's wall, the peace in his expression that she'd never seen during his life. She thought of Astrid's words about love transcending death, about connections too powerful for time to sever. Most of all, she thought of the journal burning against her heart. Not her father's journal, but hers now, carrying the weight of generations who had faced this same terrible choice. "He wouldn't want that," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Daddy wouldn't want to be saved at the cost of everyone else. He tried to sacrifice himself to protect me, but he wouldn't want me to sacrifice others to protect him." The creature's false kindness fell away, like a discarded mask. "Then you choose the harder path, little fool. You choose to lose yourself as he has lost himself, to become a guardian of mysteries that mortals were never meant to understand." "I choose to find him," Emma said firmly, pulling the journal from beneath her pajama top. Its leather cover blazed with golden light that pushed back the cavern's hungry shadows. "I choose to bring him home. Really home. Not the twisted version you're offering." The false figures began to dissolve, their accusations turning to screams that echoed off the cavern walls. But as they faded, Emma heard something else beneath their dying cries, her father's real voice, faint but growing stronger, calling her name with desperate hope. The journal's light intensified, revealing a narrow passage leading deeper into the earth. Emma gripped its warm leather tightly and walked toward her father's voice, leaving the chamber of fears behind. The real trial, she realized, was just beginning. The narrow passage stretched ahead like a throat waiting to swallow her whole. Emma followed her father's voice through twisting tunnels that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves with each step. The journal's golden light carved dancing shadows on walls that grew older the deeper she went. First carved stone, then natural rock, then something that felt older than the earth itself. "Emma, Emma, please." Her father's voice grew stronger, but now she could hear the pain threaded through it, the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting an impossible battle for too long. Each call sounded more desperate than the last, and Emma found herself running despite the uncertain footing, her small feet pounding against stone that felt warm and uncomfortably alive. The passage opened into another cavern, this one smaller than the Chamber of Fears, but somehow more terrible. Here, the walls pulsed like a heartbeat, and the air itself seemed thick with ancient malevolence. In the center of the space, her father knelt chained to a pillar of black stone, but these weren't physical bonds. Threads of shadow wrapped around his wrists and throat, and each thread pulsed with stolen light. "Daddy!" Emma rushed toward him, but stopped short when she saw his face. This was truly her father. She could feel the recognition singing in her blood, but the 2 years of fighting had carved deep lines around his eyes. His hair, once dark brown like hers, had gone completely white, and when he looked up at her approach, she saw a weariness that went deeper than exhaustion. "Emma, no," he gasped, struggling against the shadow bonds. "You shouldn't be here. I sealed the passage. I died to keep you safe." "The passage reopened, Daddy. And I came to bring you home." Her father's expression crumpled with a grief so profound that Emma felt it in her own chest like a physical blow. "Oh, my brave girl, you don't understand. There is no home for me anymore. The trial, what I learned about our bloodline, about what we're meant to become, I can't carry that knowledge back into your world. It would poison everything good and innocent there." Emma stepped closer, raising the journal's light higher. In its golden glow, she could see that the shadow threads weren't just binding her father. They were slowly draining him, pulling something essential from his core and feeding it to the hungering darkness around them. "That's not your choice to make," she said, surprised by the firmness in her voice. "You tried to decide for me before, and look where it got us. Maybe the knowledge is poison, but maybe it's also medicine. Maybe our family needs to know the truth, even if it hurts." "You're 8 years old," her father said desperately. "You should be worried about homework and playground arguments, not ancient obligations and the space between worlds." "But I'm not just 8 years old," Emma replied, understanding flooding through her as she spoke. "I'm Emma Larsen, daughter of Marcus Larsen, granddaughter of Eric Larsen, who walked these same paths in 1943. I'm part of a line that stretches back to the first Vikings who made bargains with beings older than memory, and I'm here because someone has to be." The cavern shuddered around them, and Emma realized with growing horror that her father wasn't just imprisoned. He was serving as some kind of seal, his life force the only thing keeping something vast and terrible locked away in the deeper darkness. The shadow threads weren't just draining him. They were using his strength to maintain barriers that had been weakening for decades. "The entity in the first chamber," she whispered. "It wasn't lying about everything. You really can't come home, can you? Not while this thing needs a guardian." Her father's eyes filled with tears that glowed like starlight in the journal's radiance. "I tried to spare you this, little star. I thought if I took the burden entirely on myself, you could live free." Emma approached the pillar of black stone, feeling waves of malevolent cold radiating from its surface. Up close, she could see that the shadow threads weren't just connected to her father. They had roots that went deep into the stone itself, and beyond that, into something that her mind refused to fully comprehend. "What if we shared it?" she asked quietly. "What if you didn't have to carry it alone?" "No." Her father's voice turned sharp with panic. "Emma, no. The price of becoming a guardian is everything human about you. I've felt myself changing, felt pieces of who I was being carved away. I won't let that happen to you." But Emma was already reaching for the nearest shadow thread, the journal's heat intensifying until it felt like holding molten gold. Maybe it doesn't have to work that way. Maybe the old guardians did it wrong because they tried to do it alone. Her fingers closed around the thread of shadow, and agony exploded through every nerve in her body. But underneath the pain, she felt something else. Her father's memories, his love, the desperate strength that had kept him fighting for 2 years. She also felt the thing beyond the stone stirring with hungry interest as it sensed fresh blood approaching its prison. The journal cracked in half, its golden light fracturing into 1,000 burning fragments that scattered like stars across the cavern floor. Emma screamed as the shadow thread began pulling her essence away, and distantly heard her father calling her name in absolute despair. The darkness reached up to claim them both. The darkness poured into Emma like ice water flooding her veins, but instead of drowning her, something extraordinary happened. The scattered fragments of the journal's light began to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, and suddenly she wasn't alone in the shadow thread's grip. She was 8 years old, standing in her father's study as he showed her how to read ancient runes carved into whalebone. She was 12, 37, 63, experiencing the memories of every Larsen who had ever touched these same threads of power. She was her great-great-grandmother Sigrid, barely 16, binding herself to the first guardian stone while Viking raiders burned her village. She was her grandfather Eric, tears streaming down his face as he chose duty over the family he'd never see again. But most clearly, most powerfully, she was herself, Emma Larsen, 8 years old and absolutely terrified, but holding tight to something the other guardians had never possessed. "I'm not alone," she gasped through the agony, her voice echoing strangely in the cavern. "Daddy, I can feel you. I can feel all of them." Her father stared at her in amazement as the shadow thread connecting them began to change. Instead of the hungry, draining darkness she'd expected, Emma felt warmth flowing between them, not the terrible heat of the journal, but something gentler. The kind of warmth that came from her mother's hugs, from falling asleep in her father's arms during bedtime stories, from belonging to something larger than herself. "How are you doing this?" her father whispered, and Emma realized that his bonds were loosening, the shadow threads transforming into something that looked almost like golden rope. "I don't know," Emma admitted, but even as she spoke, understanding dawned. "The other guardians, they all came here alone, didn't they? They faced the trial by themselves, made the choice by themselves, carried the burden by themselves." "Yes," her father said, struggling to his feet as the last of the shadow bonds fell away. "The trial is meant to strip away human connections, to make the guardians something apart from mortal concerns." Emma felt the thing beyond the stone stirring with confusion and growing anger as its prison keeper began to slip from its grasp. But she also felt something else, a network of light that stretched far beyond this cavern, connecting her to every person who had ever mattered to her. Her mother, sleeping fitfully in their hotel room. Astrid, Eric, Raven, and Ingrid, standing vigil at the entrance to this realm. Even her teachers, her classmates, the librarian who always saved the best new books for her, all of them woven together in a web of love that the darkness couldn't touch. "Maybe that's where they went wrong," she said, stepping closer to her father as the cavern shook around them. "Maybe the guardian isn't supposed to be separate. Maybe they're supposed to be the connection." The entity behind the stone let out a sound that was felt rather than heard, a scream of rage that made the ancient walls tremble. For 1,000 years, it had fed on the isolation of its guardians, slowly consuming their humanity until nothing remained but duty and sacrifice. But Emma's revelation was changing the very nature of the binding, transforming a prison built on loneliness into something far stronger. "Emma," her father said urgently, "whatever you're doing, the entity is fighting it. I can feel the barriers weakening." But Emma wasn't afraid anymore. She reached out and took her father's hand, and the moment their skin touched, the transformed threads blazed with brilliant light. She could see now what the ancient Larsens had never understood. The guardian wasn't meant to stand alone against the darkness. They were meant to be a bridge, connecting the love and hope of the human world to the wild magic of the elder realm. "We don't have to choose," she breathed, the revelation hitting her like lightning. "We don't have to become something inhuman to serve as guardians. We just have to remember that we're human, and that being human means being connected to others." The cavern filled with golden light as every shadow thread in the chamber transformed, creating a web of warm radiance that pulsed with the heartbeats of everyone Emma loved. The entity's screams grew fainter, not because it was escaping, but because it was finally truly contained, not by isolation and sacrifice, but by the unbreakable bonds between people who refused to let go of each other. Her father squeezed her hand, and for the first time in 2 years, he looked like himself again. "My brilliant, impossible daughter," he murmured. "You've done something that generations of guardians never thought possible. I've figured out how to bring you home," Emma said simply. Above them, the cavern ceiling began to crack open like an eggshell, revealing not the hotel ceiling Emma expected, but a star-filled sky where Aurora danced in celebration. The way back to their world was opening, and this time, nobody would be left behind. The darkness had been defeated not by force or sacrifice, but by an 8-year-old girl who understood that love really could transcend death itself. The star-filled sky above them pulsed with aurora light, but Emma could feel her father's hand trembling in hers. The golden web of connections that had transformed the shadow threads was beautiful, powerful, and completely unstable. Each pulse of light flickered weaker than the last, and she could sense the entity below stirring with renewed hunger as it tested the boundaries of its transformed prison. "Emma," her father said softly, his voice carrying both wonder and worry. "What you've done is miraculous, but I can feel the strain on the binding, the connections you've created. They're not anchored properly. Without the old guardian structure to support them, they're burning themselves out." Emma closed her eyes and reached out along the golden threads, feeling the network of love and memory that stretched back to their world. Her mother's sleeping mind, restless with dreams of loss. Astrid and the others maintaining their vigil at the excavation site. The hotel room where Emma's body lay unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. Each connection was real, vital, and draining her more with every moment. "I can't hold it," she whispered, fear creeping back into her voice. "Daddy, I can feel myself getting smaller. The light is using me up." Her father's grip tightened, and suddenly Emma felt something new flowing through their joined hands. Not just his love, but his knowledge. 2 years of studying the Guardian mysteries, of learning how the ancient bindings actually worked. The information flooded through her like water through a broken dam, overwhelming but essential. "The old Guardians weren't wrong about everything," her father said urgently. "They understood that the binding needs a stable foundation, but they thought that meant cutting away human connections. What if—" his eyes widened as understanding dawned. "What if we built the foundation from those connections instead? Not one guardian standing alone, but a circle of them, each one anchored to the world by love." Emma felt the truth of it resonate through the golden threads. She thought of Astrid, who had loved her own guardian so fiercely that she'd waited 1,000 years for his return. Of Ingrid and Raven, bound to each other across lifetimes. Of her mother, whose love for Emma's father had never wavered despite his mysterious disappearance. "They're already guardians," she breathed. "Not the old kind, but something new. They've been holding the connections steady from the other side." Above them, the aurora began to spiral downward, forming a shimmering bridge between the cavern and the world beyond. Emma could see figures moving on its surface, Astrid's red hair blazing like flame, her mother's familiar silhouette, others she didn't recognize but somehow knew. The extended family of guardians and beloved ones who had been called by Emma's desperate magic. "We need to go up," Emma said, tugging on her father's hand. "But slowly. If we ascend too fast, the bindings will snap." Together they stepped onto the Aurora Bridge, their feet finding purchase on light itself. With each step upward, Emma felt the network of connections growing stronger, not weaker. The people above weren't just anchor points. They were active participants, pouring their own strength into the web of protection that held the entity contained. "It's working," her father said in amazement. "The binding is stabilizing. But Emma, what happens when we reach the top? I can't return to our world carrying the guardian knowledge. It will change everything." Emma paused, considering. Below them, the entity tested its prison with malevolent patience. Above them, she could sense her mother's desperate hope, Astrid's ancient wisdom, the collective determination of everyone who had ever loved someone, lost to the spaces between worlds. "Maybe everything needs to change," she said finally. "Maybe keeping the guardian knowledge secret is what made it so dangerous. The old way created guardians who were isolated, who made decisions alone and sacrificed themselves in silence. But what if we shared the burden? What if we told the truth?" As they climbed higher, Emma began to see the shape of something unprecedented. Not the return to normal life she dreamed of, nor the solitary heroism that had claimed so many of their ancestors. Instead, a new way forward, one that honored both the guardian legacy and the human connections that made life worth protecting. "We'll need help," she said. her voice growing stronger with each step. "Mom will need to understand about the family history. Astrid and the others will have to teach us things the universities never knew. And we'll have to find other guardian families, other bloodlines that have been facing this alone for too long." Her father smiled, and in the aurora light, he looked like himself again. Not the broken man she'd found in the cavern, but the father who had read her bedtime stories and promised that love could overcome anything. "My brilliant, impossible daughter," he said, "you're not just bringing me home, you're bringing home a revolution." The star-filled sky opened wider above them, and Emma felt the first whisper of familiar air against her face. Soon, they would step back into their own world, forever changed, but finally, truly together. The first sensation was cold, not the supernatural chill of the between realm, but the honest winter bite of Norwegian air against Emma's face. She gasped, her eyes flying open to find herself lying on hard-packed snow, her father's hand still clasped tightly in hers. Above them, the aurora faded like a closing door, leaving only ordinary stars scattered across the pre-dawn sky. "Emma," her mother's voice cracked with relief and exhaustion. "Oh God, Emma, you've been unconscious for 3 hours. I couldn't wake you, couldn't—" The words died as Dr. Larsen's gaze fell on the man lying beside her daughter in the excavation pit. Emma felt her father's fingers tighten around hers as he struggled to sit up, his white hair stark against the dark earth. For a moment that stretched like eternity, her parents stared at each other across 2 years of grief, disbelief, and impossible hope. "Marcus?" The word escaped her mother's lips like a prayer. "Hello, Catherine," her father said softly, and Emma heard centuries of longing compressed into those 2 simple words. The reunion that followed was messy, desperate, and punctuated by her mother's academic mind demanding explanations even as her heart accepted the miracle before her. But Emma found her attention drifting to the others who had gathered at the dig site. Astrid stood at the edge of the pit, her ancient eyes bright with satisfaction, while Eric and Ingrid flanked her like sentinels. Raven crouched nearby, her modern clothes incongruous among the Viking garb, but her expression just as knowing. "The binding holds," Astrid announced, her voice carrying across the excavation site. "But it has changed beyond recognition. The old ways are truly dead now." Emma pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly as the full weight of what they'd accomplished settled over her. The golden threads she'd created still hummed beneath her consciousness, connecting her to everyone present and stretching beyond to touch other guardian bloodlines she was only beginning to sense. But instead of draining her, the network felt like a source of strength. "What happens now?" Emma asked, looking around at the circle of faces, some ancient, some modern, all watching her with a mixture of respect and anticipation that made her deeply uncomfortable. "I'm still just 8 years old. I don't know how to lead a revolution." "You don't have to," her father said, climbing out of the pit with movements that spoke of someone remembering how to be human again. "The network you created, it's self-sustaining now. Each guardian family will contribute what they can, support the others when they falter. No one bears the burden alone anymore." "But there will still be consequences," Astrid warned, her gaze fixed on Dr. Larsen, who was frantically taking notes even as tears streamed down her face. "The academic world, your government, the ordinary people who have lived safely ignorant of the elder realms, they will all demand answers. Some will not accept the truth gracefully." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She thought of her quiet life before all this began, of library corners and homework assignments and the simple grief of missing her father. That innocence was gone forever, replaced by knowledge that would reshape everything she touched. "We'll face it together," she said finally, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "All of us. That's what the new way means, right? No more secrets, no more choosing between duty and love." Her father nodded, but Emma could see worry lines deepening around his eyes. "The entity below is contained, but not destroyed. The network will need constant tending, and there are other Elder Realm threats that have gone unchecked while the Guardian families fought in isolation. Now that we're connected, we'll sense all of them." The magnitude of what lay ahead threatened to overwhelm Emma's still fragile confidence. But as she looked around the excavation site, at her mother documenting impossible truths, at Astrid and the others preparing to step out of legend and into the modern world, at her father learning to breathe free air again. She felt the golden threads pulse with shared determination. "Then we better start," she said simply. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Soon, the rest of the excavation team would arrive to find their dig site transformed, their careful archaeological assumptions shattered by the presence of living Vikings and returned dead. The Norwegian authorities would ask questions. The international media would descend. The comfortable boundaries between myth and reality would crumble. Emma Larsen, 8 years old and carrier of guardian fire, stood at the center of it all and felt the weight of centuries settling on her small shoulders. But this time, the burden didn't crush her. It connected her to everyone who had ever loved something enough to fight for it. The final confrontation was coming, not with darkness this time, but with a world that would have to choose between comfortable lies and impossible truths. She was ready. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the morning's stillness like a blade through silk. Emma felt the golden threads in her consciousness vibrate with sudden tension as headlights swept across the excavation site, casting long shadows that danced between ancient and impossible. 3 cars, Raven reported quietly, her modern sensibilities attuned to the approaching threat. Government plates on the lead vehicle. Someone called this in. Dr. Larsen looked up from her frantic note-taking, her academic excitement colliding with maternal protectiveness. "Emma, maybe you should—" "No." Emma's voice carried an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. No more hiding, no more choosing between the truth and safety. She felt her father's hand settle on her shoulder, warm and real and anchoring her to this moment. This is what the new way means. Astrid stepped forward, her Viking garb gleaming in the headlights as the first car pulled to a stop. "Child, are you certain? Once we cross this threshold, there is no returning to the comfortable shadows. The world will know what it has tried so hard to forget." Emma closed her eyes and reached out along the network of connections, feeling the pulse of other guardian families across the globe. In Scotland, a family of lighthouse keepers felt something stir in waters they'd watched for generations. In Iceland, a woman tending ancient thermal springs suddenly understood why her grandmother's warnings had always felt so urgent. In the mountains of Norway, scattered descendants of old bloodlines lifted their heads like wolves scenting the wind. "They're all waking up," Emma whispered, wonder and terror warring in her voice. "The network. It's not just connecting us, it's calling to everyone with guardian blood, everyone whose family forgot what they were meant to protect." Car doors slammed shut. Voices carried across the frozen ground, officials skeptical, demanding explanations for reports of unusual activity at the dig site. Emma opened her eyes to see a tall man in a dark coat approaching, flanked by others whose posture screamed authority and barely contained alarm. "Dr. Larsen?" The lead official's voice was carefully neutral. "I'm Inspector Haugen, Norwegian Archaeological Service. We received some rather unusual reports about your excavation. Claims of unauthorized personnel, possible theft of artifacts, and—" His words died as his gaze fell on Astrid, then on Emma's father, then on the impossible collection of living Vikings standing calmly in the snow. Emma felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. She could sense her father's guardian instincts urging concealment, protective magic that would cloud minds and edit memories. Her mother's academic training was already constructing rational explanations that would preserve careers and avoid difficult questions. Even Astrid seemed poised to fade back into legend, to retreat into the spaces between myth and reality. But the Golden Network pulsed with a different possibility. "Inspector Haugen," Emma said, stepping forward with her small chin raised. "My name is Emma Larsen, and I need to tell you about my family." The words came easier than she'd expected, flowing along the threads of connection that linked her to centuries of guardians who had carried their secrets in silence. She spoke of bloodlines and bindings, of entities that slept beneath sacred sites, of the price that isolation had demanded from protectors who thought they had to stand alone. The inspector's face cycled through disbelief. concern for Emma's mental state, and growing alarm as Astrid began to speak in Old Norse, her words carrying the weight of witnessed history. When Eric stepped forward and casually moved a massive stone that should have required heavy machinery, the official skepticism began to crack like ice in spring. "This is impossible," Inspector Haugen breathed, but Emma could see something shifting behind his eyes. Recognition. The awakening of blood memory that had slept for generations. "Your grandmother was Astrid Haugen," Emma said gently, following the thread of connection that pulsed between them. "She used to have dreams about standing watch on high places, didn't she? Dreams about lights under the water that shouldn't exist." The inspector's face went white. "How could you possibly—" "Because you're one of us," Emma said simply. "Your family line has been guarding the Lofoten waters for 800 years. They just forgot what they were watching for." Around the excavation site, similar recognitions were blooming like flowers in Fast Forward. The other officials, the approaching backup vehicles, even the early arriving excavation team. Threads of Guardian heritage revealed themselves as Emma's network touched minds that had been sleeping their way through inherited duties. "This changes everything," her mother whispered, her scientific worldview crumbling and reforming with each impossible revelation. Emma nodded, feeling the weight of transformation spreading outward from this moment like ripples on still water. The old world of hidden guardians and compartmentalized truth was ending. What would replace it remained to be written. "Yes," she agreed, her 8-year-old voice carrying the certainty of someone who had walked between life and death and chosen love over isolation. "Everything changes, starting now." The final test wasn't darkness or sacrifice. It was truth itself, and the courage to reshape the world with it. The moment shattered like crystal hitting stone. "No." The voice came from behind the inspector, cold and sharp as winter wind. "Absolutely not." Emma spun around to see a woman emerging from the second vehicle, tall, severe, wearing the kind of expensive coat that spoke of government authority far above local archaeological oversight. Her pale eyes swept the impossible scene before her with the calculation of someone accustomed to making problems disappear. "Director Svensson," Inspector Haugen said, his voice uncertain as his newly awakened guardian instincts warred with bureaucratic training. "These people are delusional cultists exploiting a grieving child." Director Svensson cut him off, her gaze fixing on Emma with predatory intensity. "Dr. Larsen, I'm placing you under immediate review for child endangerment. The girl requires psychiatric evaluation, and these," she gestured dismissively at Astrid and the others, "unauthorized individuals need to be detained for questioning." Emma felt the golden network recoil as if struck. The threads of awakening that had been spreading outward suddenly constricted, guardian bloodlines across the globe flinching back into dormancy as modern authority asserted itself with brutal efficiency. "You can't." Dr. Larsen stepped protectively in front of Emma, her mother's fury blazing despite her academic cautiousness. "I can and will." Director Svensson raised her hand, and Emma saw the glint of something metallic in her palm. Not a weapon, something else. Something that made the air itself feel heavy and wrong. "The Norwegian government has protocols for containing archaeological anomalies, protocols that have been in place for over a century." Emma's blood turned to ice as understanding crashed over her. "You know," she whispered, "you've always known about the Guardians." Director Svensson's smile was sharp as a blade. "Of course we know. Why do you think Guardian families have been scattered and isolated for so long? Why do you think the old knowledge has been systematically forgotten?" She took a step closer, and Emma felt the golden threads writhing in pain. "The entity your ancestors bound isn't the only Elder Realm threat, child, and governments learned long ago that uncontrolled guardians are almost as dangerous as the things they fight." Astrid snarled, her hand moving to her sword, but Director Svensson raised the device higher and the Viking woman stumbled as if struck by invisible force. "Magnetized iron," the director explained conversationally, "disrupts the metaphysical resonance that allows you, anomalies, to maintain coherence. Very effective on both the living and the supposedly dead." Emma's father stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Director, you don't understand what my daughter has accomplished. the network she's created, is exactly the kind of uncontrolled guardian collaboration that the protocols were designed to prevent. Director Svensson's voice turned arctic. Scattered guardians, working alone, following carefully managed guidelines, that's sustainable, that's controllable. But your daughter has done something unprecedented and catastrophically dangerous. She's connected guardian bloodlines across the globe without oversight, without safeguards, without any consideration for the consequences. The device in her hand pulsed, and Emma felt the golden network convulse. Connections that had awakened moments ago began severing themselves, guardian families worldwide suddenly forgetting why they'd lifted their heads, why they'd felt called to something larger than themselves. "Stop!" Emma cried out. But Director Svensson ignored her, continuing to speak with the calm authority of someone unveiling an inevitable conclusion. "The entity below isn't contained, child. It's been feeding on your network, growing stronger with each connection you forged. Your father didn't escape. He was released, as bait, to draw out the next generation of guardians so they could all be identified and controlled." The words hit Emma like physical blows. She looked at her father, desperate for denial, but saw only growing horror in his eyes as suppressed memories began surfacing. "The voices in the cavern," he whispered. "They weren't just the entity. There were others, modern voices, giving instructions, making promises. Government oversight has kept the Elder Realm threats contained for over 100 years," Director Svensson continued remorselessly. "But your little revolution threatens to upset that balance. Untrained guardians, emotional connections overriding practical judgment, ancient entities gaining power from the very networks meant to bind them. It's a recipe for global catastrophe." Emma felt the weight of terrible choice settling on her shoulders. Surrender to government control, accept the dismantling of everything she'd built to save her father, and preserve the careful status quo that had kept the world stable, or fight back against overwhelming authority and risk proving Director Svensson's warnings correct. Around her, she could sense the others. Her mother torn between protecting her daughter and accepting rational authority, her father struggling with suppressed memories of manipulation, Astrid and the ancient guardians preparing for a battle they might not be able to win. The golden network pulsed weakly, still connecting her to guardian families worldwide, but she could feel them wavering, uncertain, afraid. Everything hung in balance on Emma's next choice. Emma stood frozen in the terrible silence that followed Director Svensson's revelation, feeling the weight of impossible choice crushing down on her 8-year-old shoulders. The golden network writhed in agony, guardian families across the globe crying out in confusion as their awakening connections were systematically severed by the device in the director's hand. She could surrender. Accept the government's control, let them dismantle everything she'd built to save her father. Return to the careful isolation that had kept the world stable for a century. It would be the safe choice, the rational choice, the choice that would protect everyone she loved from the consequences of her naive revolution. But as the device pulsed again and another thread of connection died screaming, Emma felt something deeper than guardian fire stir within her chest. Not the inherited power of her bloodline, something smaller, more human, and infinitely more dangerous. Love. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the winter air like a bell. "I don't understand the consequences. I'm 8 years old, and I make decisions based on what feels right instead of what's practical." She looked up at Director Svensson, her dark eyes steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "But I understand something you don't." The device wavered in the director's grip as Emma stepped forward, ignoring her mother's sharp intake of breath. "You've spent 100 years managing guardian families like resources, scattering them, controlling them, making sure they never remember what they really are." Emma's voice strengthened as she reached deeper into the network, feeling the pain of severed connections like physical wounds. "You've turned protectors into prisoners, and you think that's victory. Child, you're playing with forces beyond your comprehension." "No." Emma's interruption rang with authority that seemed impossible from someone so small. "You're the one who doesn't understand. The entity below isn't growing stronger because of my network. It's growing stronger because of your control. She closed her eyes and reached out along the golden threads, following them down through layers of reality to touch the ancient presence bound beneath the excavation site. What she found there made her gasp, not malevolence, but a vast and terrible loneliness that matched her own grief, magnified 1,000-fold. It was never evil, she whispered, understanding flooding through her like cold water. It was just cut off, isolated. Like the guardians, like my father, like everyone you forced to bear their burdens alone. She opened her eyes and met Director Svensson's gaze. You created the very thing you were trying to prevent. The device in the director's hand began to spark as Emma's realization traveled along the network, awakening connections that ran deeper than blood or duty. Every guardian family worldwide suddenly understood what they'd lost, not just their purpose, but their fundamental connection to each other and the world they protected. Stop this, Director Svensson commanded, raising the device higher. You'll doom us all. Maybe, Emma agreed, and the simple honesty in her voice was more frightening than any threat. But I know what happens if I don't try. She looked at her father, seeing the anguish in his eyes as suppressed memories continued to surface. At her mother, brilliant and rational and terrified of losing her daughter to forces beyond academic understanding. At Astrid and the ancient guardians, ready to fight and die for principles that might be wrong. I'm sorry, Emma whispered, and reached out to embrace them all. Not with her arms, with the network itself, pouring everything she had into the golden threads that connected them. Her guardian fire, her grief for a father lost and found, her love for a mother who tried to protect her with silence, her desperate hope that isolation wasn't the only answer to an impossible world. The device in Director Svensson's hand exploded in a shower of sparks as the network suddenly blazed brighter than the rising sun. Emma felt her strength pouring out along every connection, her life force spreading thin across continents to touch guardian families who'd forgotten they weren't alone. But instead of weakening her, the sharing made her stronger. Each awakened guardian sent their own power flowing back along the threads, creating a feedback loop of connection that transformed the network from a tool of control into something entirely new. The binding, Astrid breathed, her ancient eyes wide with wonder. Child, you're not just connecting the guardians, you're including the entity in the network. Emma nodded weakly, feeling the vast presence below responding to her offer of connection with something like gratitude. The loneliness that had driven it to rage was dissolving as it finally touched other minds, finally understood that it didn't have to bear its burden alone. The cost hit her like a physical blow. To include the entity in the network permanently, to transform it from a bound prisoner into a willing partner, she would have to give up the one thing she'd fought so hard to save, her exclusive connection to her father. The golden thread that linked them, born from love and sacrifice, would have to expand to include everyone, guardians and entities alike. She could save him, save them all, but their special bond would become part of something infinitely larger. Emma looked at her father through tears and saw understanding in his eyes. I know, little star, he whispered. I know. The choice felt like stepping off a cliff into endless sky. Emma closed her eyes and let go, feeling the golden thread that connected her to her father bloom outward like a flower opening to sunlight. The exclusive bond they'd shared, forged in grief, tempered by love, strong enough to pull him back from death itself, dissolved into something vast and welcoming that embraced every guardian, every entity, every lonely soul who had carried their burden in isolation. The transformation rippled outward with the force of a tsunami. Director Svensson's device crumbled to ash in her hand as the old bindings shattered, replaced by connections built on understanding rather than control. The ancient entity beneath the excavation site rose not in rage but in wonder, its consciousness touching the network with the tentative joy of someone finding home after centuries of exile. It's beautiful, Emma's father whispered, his form solidifying as the entity's power flowed freely through willing channels instead of fighting against prison walls. Emma, what you've done, it's not just salvation, it's evolution. Around them, the other officials stood transfixed as guardian heritage awakened in their bloodlines. like flowers blooming in time-lapse. Inspector Haugen straightened with the bearing of someone remembering 800 years of purpose. Even Director Svensson's rigid composure cracked as suppressed memories surfaced. A grandmother who spoke of lights beneath the waves, a calling that government protocols had taught her to bury. Emma swayed on her feet, the effort of reshaping reality leaving her exhausted but strangely peaceful. Her mother caught her before she could fall, academic skepticism dissolving into fierce protective love. "My brave girl," Dr. Larsen murmured, holding Emma tight. "What have you done?" "Fixed something that was broken," Emma replied, her 8-year-old voice carrying hard-won wisdom. "Made it so nobody has to be alone anymore." The changes weren't confined to the excavation site. Through the network, Emma could feel guardian families across the globe lifting their heads in recognition, scattered bloodlines in Iceland remembering their vigil over sleeping volcanoes, Aboriginal elders in Australia sensing the song of entities that had been part of the dreamtime since creation, Native American tribes on sacred mountains understanding why their ancestors had spoken of starwalkers and sky bridges. Connections that government control had severed were reforming along lines of kinship older than nations. But it wasn't chaos. The entity's vast consciousness served as a stabilizing presence, its ancient wisdom providing guidance to awakening guardians who might otherwise have been overwhelmed by suddenly inherited purpose. Instead of the uncontrolled revelation Director Svensson had feared, Emma's network was creating its own careful equilibrium. Power shared rather than hoarded, knowledge given freely rather than hidden, burdens carried by many instead of few. "The old world is ending," Astrid said, her fierce smile softened by something like maternal pride. "The child has done what we could not, broken the chains that bound protectors and protected alike." Emma felt the truth of it settling into her bones. The careful balance that had kept guardian families isolated and ignorant for a century was dissolving, replaced by something unprecedented, a global community of protectors who understood both their heritage and their responsibility. It would require new institutions, new protocols, new ways of keeping humanity safe from Elder Realm threats. But those structures would be built on connection rather than control, trust rather than fear. Director Svensson stood frozen, her authority crumbling as guardian families worldwide bypassed government channels and began communicating directly through the network. The protocols she'd spent her career enforcing were obsolete, replaced by something too large and organic for any single institution to control. "You don't understand what you've unleashed," she said, but her voice carried desperation rather than certainty. "Maybe not," Emma admitted, reaching out to touch the director's hand. Through the contact, she felt centuries of fear. Government officials who had witnessed Elder Realm incursions, who had seen what happened when ancient powers awakened without guidance. The protocols hadn't been born from a desire to control, but from trauma, from the very human need to prevent catastrophe by any means necessary. "But I understand what we've been missing," Emma continued gently. "Trust, hope, the belief that people can be better than their worst fears." The network pulsed with gentle warmth, and Emma felt Director Svensson's resistance begin to crack as her own guardian heritage stirred to life. Somewhere in her family line was a thread of protection, a calling that had been buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and official duty. Emma's father knelt beside them, his presence solid and real despite everything that had happened. "The network needs guides," he said quietly. "People who understand both the old dangers and the new possibilities. Your experience doesn't have to be discarded, it just needs a different context." The moment stretched like a held breath. Transformation balanced on the edge of acceptance or rejection. Around them, ancient and modern, magical and mundane, the impossible community Emma had created waited to see what shape the new world would take. The moment broke like dawn over the fjord, Director Svensson's rigid composure finally cracking as tears streaked down her weathered face. Emma felt the woman's resistance dissolve through their connected hands, decades of fear and control giving way to something she'd forgotten she possessed: wonder. "I remember," Director Svensson whispered, her voice thick with suppressed emotion. "My grandmother used to tell stories about lights beneath the ice. She said our family watched the northern passages, kept things sleeping that should sleep. She looked up at Emma with eyes that seemed younger, clearer. I thought they were fairy tales. They were history, Emma said gently, feeling the director's guardian heritage unfurling like wings long held folded. And now they're the future too. The network pulsed with acceptance as Director Svensson's transformation rippled outward, government protocols reshaping themselves from the inside as officials worldwide felt their own bloodline memories stirring. What had begun as Emma's desperate attempt to save her father was becoming something unprecedented, a global awakening that honored both ancient wisdom and modern necessity. Come on, Emma's mother said softly, helping her daughter to her feet. It's time to go home. But as they walked toward the waiting vehicles, Emma realized home wasn't the same place she'd left. Through the network, she could feel guardians across Norway emerging from isolation, families in Bergen sensing the oil platforms they were meant to monitor, herders in Finnmark understanding why the aurora spoke to them in their dreams. The careful silence that had blanketed guardian communities for generations was lifting like morning mist. Her father walked beside them, solid and warm despite everything impossible about his presence. The entity's power flowed through willing channels now, sustaining him not as a prisoner dragged from death, but as a bridge between worlds, living proof that love could transcend the boundaries that separated guardian from protected. Will you be able to stay? Emma asked, slipping her hand into his. In a way I never could before, he replied, squeezing her fingers gently. The network isn't just connecting guardians, little star, it's healing the wounds that kept our worlds apart. They drove south through a landscape that looked unchanged but felt fundamentally different. The ancient burial mounds scattered across the countryside seemed less like relics and more like sleeping sentinels, their guardian families finally understanding their purpose. In small towns along the route, Emma caught glimpses through the network of awakening communities. A baker in Lillehammer, whose bread had always carried protective properties she'd never questioned. A fisherman in Älvsund who realized why certain waters had always felt sacred to his family. The changes weren't without challenges. Emergency protocols activated as government agencies worldwide scrambled to understand what had happened. But instead of chaos, the network provided guidance. Experienced guardians reaching out to newly awakened ones, sharing knowledge that had been hoarded for centuries, creating support structures that transcended national boundaries. Director Svensson rode with them, her official demeanor replaced by something Emma's mother recognized from her own academic circles, the excitement of someone discovering an entirely new field of study. We'll need new institutions, the director said, her mind already racing ahead to practical considerations. Training programs for awakened guardians, protocols for entity contact, liaison offices to coordinate between traditional governments and guardian communities. Built on partnership instead of control, Emma's father added. The network can facilitate communication, but it can't replace human choice and responsibility. Emma dozed against her mother's shoulder as they neared Trondheim, exhaustion finally claiming her as the adrenaline of transformation faded. But even in sleep, she remained connected to the vast web of consciousness she'd created, feeling the contentment of the ancient entity as it explored its new role as guide rather than prisoner, sensing guardian families across the globe taking their first tentative steps into a larger world, experiencing the profound relief of burdens finally shared. When she woke, they were pulling into their driveway. The house looked exactly as they'd left it, but Emma could feel the difference humming in the air. Neighbors, whose bloodlines carried guardian heritage, beginning to remember why certain sounds in the night had never frightened them, why some storms felt like old friends rather than threats. Will things be normal now? She asked, as they climbed the front steps. Her mother laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in years. Emma, my brave girl, I don't think anything will ever be normal again. But perhaps that's not such a bad thing. Inside, Emma curled up in her father's lap, while her mother made tea with hands that shook only slightly. Through the network, she could feel the first guardian councils forming, ancient knowledge being shared with modern understanding, new structures taking shape to protect a world that was both exactly as it had been and completely transformed. Emma closed her eyes and smiled, finally understanding what Astrid had meant about love being the strongest magic of all. She'd saved her father, but more importantly, she'd created a world where no one would have to face the darkness alone again. The return was complete, but the real adventure was just beginning. The new beginning. 6 months later, Emma sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by letters from guardian children around the world. The network hummed quietly in the background of her consciousness now, as natural as breathing. Through it, she could feel Marcus in Iceland learning to sense volcanic tremors with his grandmother, and Yuki in Japan whose family tended shrines that kept ancient sea spirits peaceful. The loneliness that had once defined her existence seemed like a memory from another life. "Emma, breakfast!" her mother called from downstairs, and Emma smiled at the sound. Dr. Larsen had thrown herself into documenting the new world with characteristic academic fervor, leading the university's newly established Department of Guardian Studies. Her rational mind had found its place alongside the magical creating frameworks that helped both communities understand each other. Emma bounded downstairs to find her father making pancakes, flour dusting his hands in a wonderfully ordinary way. His presence had stabilized over the months, the network's power sustaining him through willing partnership, rather than desperate magic. He taught Guardian history now at the same university where her mother worked, their expertise combining to help newly awakened families understand their heritage. "How's the correspondence project going?" he asked, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. "Amazing," Emma replied, settling at the kitchen table where her mother was already reading reports from Guardian councils worldwide. "There's a boy in Scotland whose family has been watching stone circles for 800 years, and they never knew why until now. And the Aboriginal elders in Australia, they're teaching everyone how the Dreamtime connections work." It still amazed Emma how quickly the new structures had developed. Director Svensson, now Director of Guardian Liaison Services, had proven remarkably effective at creating institutions that served rather than controlled. The old government protocols had been restructured around support and coordination, helping Guardian families access resources and training while respecting their autonomy. "Speaking of connections," her mother said, looking up from her tablet, "Astrid sent word that the excavation site is officially being converted into a Guardian Heritage Center. She'll be teaching there." Emma grinned. The fierce Viking woman had adapted to the modern world with surprising grace, her ancient wisdom invaluable in helping newly awakened guardians understand their roles. The impossible wooden hall had become a place of learning, where time-worn knowledge met contemporary understanding. After breakfast, Emma walked to school through streets that felt transformed. The network allowed her to sense the Guardian families scattered throughout Trondheim, a librarian whose collection had always mysteriously contained exactly the book someone needed, a bus driver whose routes somehow never encountered the worst accidents, a park groundskeeper whose plants thrived in ways that defied botanical explanation. They nodded to her as she passed, recognition flowing through connections deeper than sight. At school, Emma found herself in the strange position of being simultaneously famous and ordinary. Her classmates knew she was the girl who'd done something important during the winter expedition, but the full truth remained within Guardian communities. She was still shy, still loved books more than playground games, but the crushing isolation that had once defined her was gone. Through the network, she always felt connected to something larger. During lunch, she sat with Anna Christofferson, whose family had awakened to their role as bridge guardians, people who ensured safe passage across treacherous mountain routes. Anna was teaching Emma Norwegian folk songs that carried protective magic, while Emma shared techniques for strengthening network connections. "My grandmother says the old songs work better now," Anna said, her voice bright with wonder. "It's like they were waiting for something to wake up." Emma nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The network hadn't just connected guardians, it had reawakened the symbiosis between magical and mundane worlds that had been dormant for centuries. Ancient protections were strengthening, not through force or binding, but through willing cooperation. That evening, as snow began to fall outside her bedroom window, Emma settled into her father's lap for their nightly ritual. He still read her stories, but now they also shared experiences through the network. glimpses of guardian families worldwide, updates from the ancient entity that had become humanity's unexpected ally, the quiet satisfaction of a world learning to protect itself through connection rather than isolation. "Do you ever miss how things used to be?" Emma asked, watching snowflakes dance in the lamplight. Her father considered the question seriously. "I miss the simplicity," he admitted. "But I don't miss the loneliness. What you created, little star, it's not just a network, it's hope made manifest." Through her window, Emma could see the lights of Trondheim spread below, each one representing families and lives that were now part of something larger. Guardian children were growing up knowing their purpose. Ancient entities slept peacefully, tended by willing protectors. The barriers between worlds remained, but they were permeable now, allowing love and wisdom to flow freely. Emma closed her eyes and let her awareness expand along the golden threads of connection, feeling the pulse of a world transformed. Somewhere in Scotland, a boy was learning to read stone circle songs. In Australia, elders were sharing dream-time wisdom with eager students. In Iceland, a girl was giggling as volcanic spirits played gentle games through her grandmother's teachings. The network thrummed with contentment, not the fragile peace of enforced control, but the robust harmony of willing cooperation. Emma had saved her father, but in doing so, she'd given the world something infinitely more valuable: the understanding that no one had to face the darkness alone. Outside, the snow fell softly on a world where magic and mundane had finally learned to dance together, and Emma Larsen, no longer the lonely girl who'd traveled north in desperate hope, smiled and dreamed of all the wonders tomorrow might bring.